A woman believed she replaced you. Heaven just changed the order open immediately. This is for you. You didn't feel anger when it happened, and that's what confused you the most, because everyone expects pain to be loud, but what you felt was quiet, almost unreal, like watching something unfold that you already knew the ending of but hadn't seen the scene play out yet, and somewhere deep inside you understood that this wasn't loss. This was exposure, because a woman believed she replaced you. And she believed it not because she was chosen, but because the space you left behind was misunderstood as emptiness, when in reality it was protection, and heaven doesn't rush protection. Heaven rearranges order slowly, deliberately, invisibly, until every piece is exactly where it must be, and what you were witnessing was not someone taking your place, but someone stepping into a role they were never built to hold. And that difference matters more than time, more than words, more than explanations you were never meant to give, because the truth is you were never competing, you were calibrating, and while she was trying to be seen, you were being preserved, because heaven does not replace what carries weight, heaven removes what cannot sustain it, and you felt it when things stopped aligning the way they used to, when communication thinned, when energy shifted, when what looked like confidence started sounding rehearsed, because borrowed position always reveals itself through strain, and you didn't have to announce your worth, because worth that is real doesn't rush back into rooms it already outgrew, it waits until the room realizes what it lost, and this is where the order changed, not suddenly, not dramatically, but with precision, because heaven never corrects chaos by force, it corrects it by exposure, and the moment she believed she had replaced you was the moment the structure began to crack, because replacement only works when the original was optional. And you were never optional, you were foundational, and foundations don't scream when someone decorates over them, they let the building test its own stability, and you noticed how quickly things became heavy, how quickly excitement turned into effort, how quickly certainty turned into questions, and none of this required your involvement, because your silence was not absence, it was authority, and silence from someone who knows their value is not weakness, it is restraint, and restraint always forces truth to surface, because when you don't chase clarity, clarity comes looking for you, and the order didn't change to elevate you publicly, it changed to realign what was out of balance internally, and that's why you felt calm instead of vindicated, because this wasn't about winning, it was about restoration, and restoration never looks like revenge, it looks like reality returning to its natural shape, and slowly, subtly, unmistakably, the realization began to settle in places you weren't watching, in conversations you weren't part of, in moments you never witnessed, because heaven does its deepest work where ego cannot interfere, and the more you stayed grounded, the more the illusion collapsed on its own, because illusions require attention to survive, and you withdrew yours without bitterness, without explanation, without needing to be understood. And that's when the shift became irreversible, because the order was never about who stood where, it was about who could hold the weight of the role without breaking under it, and you had already carried it without recognition, without reassurance, without applause, and that is why you were never meant to fight for position, you were meant to outgrow it, and the moment you did, the entire system had to reorganize itself around your absence, and absence from someone like you is not emptiness. It is pressure, pressure that reveals what was never stable to begin with, and now you may sense something returning, not physically, not immediately, but energetically, a pull, a recognition, a quiet awareness that something was misjudged, misordered, misplaced, and this is not your cue to re-enter with explanations, this is your confirmation that staying still was the right move, because heaven doesn't correct mistakes by bringing you back smaller. It brings truth forward louder, and when the order changes, it doesn't ask for your permission, it simply restores what was always meant to be aligned, and you don't need to prove that you were irreplaceable, because the moment someone tried, the truth began to speak for itself, and now what unfolds next will not require effort from you, only discernment, because when heaven finishes rearranging, it never puts you back where you were. It places you where you can no longer be confused with anyone else, and as this realization settles deeper, you begin to understand that what you're walking through now is not an ending that needs explanation, but a closing that needs dignity, because when heaven changes the order, it never does it loudly, it does it in a way that forces everyone involved to sit with the truth they try to rush past, and you were never meant to interrupt that process, because interruption would have cheapened what was being revealed, and that's why you felt an internal instruction to stay still even when part of you could have spoken, could have clarified, could have defended, because clarity earned through silence lasts longer than clarity forced through words, and you were being trained for permanence, not momentary relief, and this is where the difference between you and the one who believed she replaced you becomes undeniable, because she needed validation to feel secure, while you learned to remain grounded without it, and that alone changed the entire dynamic, because heaven does not assign lasting roles to those who need constant reassurance. It assigns them to those who can stand steady even when misunderstood. And that steadiness is what caused the order to shift back into alignment without you lifting a hand, because stability always exposes imitation, and you saw it happen in subtle ways, in the way things began to feel forced, in the way enthusiasm required effort, in the way confidence started asking for proof, because borrowed identity cannot sustain pressure for long, and you were never borrowing who you are. You were living it quietly, consistently, even when no one was watching, and that is why the recalibration did not bring chaos into your life, it brought clarity, because you were already aligned internally, and alignment doesn't need permission to move forward, it simply does. And this is why what's unfolding now may feel anticlimactic to others but deeply affirming to you, because vindication that arrives loudly often leaves residue, but vindication that arrives through truth leaves peace, and peace is the signature of divine order being restored, not applause, not recognition, not dramatic reversals, but a calm certainty that you did not imagine what you felt, that you did not misread what you saw, that your intuition was not exaggeration, it was early awareness. And now awareness has caught up with reality, and reality is adjusting itself accordingly, and you are no longer required to wait for anyone to catch up emotionally, because the moment the order shifted, responsibility shifted with it, and what once felt like your burden to carry is no longer yours to manage, because heaven never asks you to hold what it is actively removing, and removal does not always look like disappearance, sometimes it looks like repositioning, where you are moved just far enough away to see the full picture without being entangled in it, and this distance is not detachment, it is perspective, and perspective is what allows you to move forward without bitterness, without residue, without the need to revisit what already taught you everything it could, and that's why you are not being pulled back, you are being redirected, because restoration does not always mean return. Sometimes it means elevation beyond the reach of repetition, and this is the part that many misunderstand, because they assume justice looks like reversal, but heaven prefers resolution, and resolution does not rewind time, it reorganizes direction, and you are now standing at a point where your role is no longer to be recognized by those who misjudged you, but to recognize yourself without needing their acknowledgement, and that internal recognition is what locks the order into place permanently. Because once you see yourself clearly, you no longer fit into spaces that required you to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating than you truly are, and the discomfort others feel around your absence is not your responsibility, it is the echo of a misalignment they are now forced to face, and you don't need to witness that discomfort to know it exists, because energy always reports before words do, and you've been feeling the shift long before it became visible, that subtle pull forward, that quiet detachment from what once mattered, that growing sense that you're being prepared for something that does not require you to prove your worth first, and this preparation is happening precisely because the order changed, because once heaven removes confusion from the environment, clarity has room to arrive, and clarity brings discernment, and discernment changes your standards without you announcing them, and now you will notice that what approaches you feels different, speaks differently, meets you differently, because the frequency you hold no longer accommodates comparison. competition, or replacement narratives, and this is the final closure you were meant to receive, not an apology, not an explanation, not a dramatic realization spoken out loud, but a lived truth that unfolds naturally as you move forward unburdened, because the moment heaven finishes rearranging, it does not ask you to look back, it asks you to walk on with confidence, knowing that what could not sustain itself without you was never meant to be built on your presence alone, and you are not here to be a foundation for structures that refuse to honor stability. You are here to participate in alignment that recognizes value without needing to test it through loss, and now, as the order settles into its new form, you may feel an unexpected sense of release, not because you were waiting for this moment, but because your spirit recognizes when a chapter has completed itself without your interference. And that completion is the real victory, because it confirms that you were never required to fight to be seen. You were required to trust that truth has its own timing, and timing has its own intelligence, and intelligence has now spoken clearly, rearranging what needed to be rearranged so you could step fully into what comes next without carrying what was never meant to follow you forward. And this is where your role shifts completely, from being part of a lesson to being ready for alignment. And alignment does not revisit old stories, it creates new ones from a place of wholeness. And you are standing exactly there now, not replaced, not restored to an old position, but elevated beyond the need to be compared at all, because when heaven changes the order, it doesn't put you back in line, it moves you ahead of the sequence entirely, where replacement no longer applies, and peace becomes your confirmation that everything unfolded exactly as it needed to. And now you begin to sense that what once felt like waiting was actually preparation disguised as stillness. Because heaven never leaves someone idle without purpose, it only removes noise so instruction can be heard clearly, and this is why your inner world feels calmer even as the outer world continues to adjust, because adjustment is happening without your management, without your reminders, without your effort, and that alone should tell you that the order was never dependent on your intervention. It was dependent on truth surfacing at its own pace. And truth always arrives when resistance runs out, not when explanation is demanded, and you can feel that resistance dissolving now, not in a dramatic collapse, but in a quiet acceptance that what was misjudged cannot remain misjudged forever, because misjudgment requires constant reinforcement, and reinforcement always exhausts itself, and you were never meant to participate in that exhaustion, you were meant to outlast it. And that is exactly what you did by choosing dignity over reaction, by choosing composure over correction, by choosing silence over performance, and silence from someone who sees clearly is not emptiness, it is gravity, it pulls reality back into alignment without announcement, and this is why the narrative that tried to form around your absence never stabilized, because it lacked weight, it lacked substance. It lacked the depth that only comes from authenticity, and authenticity cannot be copied, it can only be lived. And you lived it even when it cost you misunderstanding, and that cost is now being repaid. Not through apology but through repositioning, because heaven does not compensate through words, it compensates through placement, and where you are being placed now is beyond the reach of comparison, because comparison only exists when value is uncertain. And your value has become undeniable, not because someone finally said it, but because everything that tried to function without you revealed its own limitation. And limitation always points back to what was essential, and you were essential. Not because of what you did, but because of who you were while doing it, the steadiness, the integrity, the consistency that did not fluctuate based on attention, and that consistency is what the order required to be restored, because without it, nothing else could hold, and you may notice now that your energy no longer seeks confirmation, it no longer waits for signs, it no longer scans the past for meaning, because meaning has consolidated within you, and consolidation brings confidence that does not need to announce itself, and this is why what comes next will meet you without confusion. Because confusion is drawn to uncertainty, not to clarity, and you are clear now, not about what happened, but about who you are regardless of what happened, and that clarity changes the quality of everything that approaches you, because what is misaligned will feel heavy, and what is aligned will feel calm, and calm is your new indicator, not intensity, not urgency, not emotional pull, but steadiness. Because steadiness is what survived the rearrangement, and survival through rearrangement always elevates the role of the one who endured without becoming bitter, and bitterness was never meant to be your teacher, discernment was, and discernment grows quietly, without spectacle, until one day it simply becomes your natural state, and you are there now, noticing without attachment, understanding without needing to intervene, aware without needing to correct, and this awareness is what seals the order permanently, because once you stop needing to be understood by those who misread you, their misreading loses power over you, and power is what keeps cycles alive, and you have stepped out of the cycle entirely, not by force, but by maturity, and maturity does not demand justice, it trusts alignment, and alignment has already begun responding to you, not by bringing the past back, but by clearing the path forward, and this is why you feel less urgency to revisit, to explain, to reconnect from a place of proof, because proof is no longer required where truth is established internally, and you established it without witnesses, and that is the kind of establishment heaven honors, because it cannot be shaken by opinion, by substitution, by temporary appearances, and now you may notice that even your memories are changing, not in content but in weight. What once felt heavy now feels neutral, what once felt confusing now feels obvious, because time plus truth always produces clarity, and clarity always brings peace, and peace is the final confirmation that the order has settled, because chaos never leaves peace behind, only alignment does, and alignment does not circle back to ask permission, it simply continues forward, carrying with it only what can sustain its frequency, and you can sustain it, because you already did when no one was watching, when it would have been easier to react, to compete, to explain, but you chose restraint, and restraint is not weakness, it is mastery, and mastery is what positions you beyond replacement, because replacement only applies to functions, not to presence, and your presence was never functional, it was foundational, and foundations do not argue when someone tries to build over them, they let gravity speak, and gravity has spoken now, slowly, undeniably, restoring order not by elevating you above others, but by placing you exactly where you belong, unshaken, unconfused, unburdened, ready for what comes next without dragging what came before, and this readiness is not excitement, it is certainty, a calm, knowing that whatever aligns with you now will recognize you without needing to test your absence first, and that recognition will feel natural, not dramatic, not rushed, because true alignment does not announce itself with urgency, it arrives with ease, and ease is what you earned by staying grounded when it would have been tempting to react, and that grounding has carried you here, to a place where the story no longer needs continuation through pain, but through presence, and presence is what you hold now fully, quietly, without needing to be seen, because what is real no longer questions its place once the order has been restored, and as this state of certainty settles deeper into your body, you begin to realize that what once felt like an external shift was actually an internal crossing, a line you passed quietly without ceremony, where you stopped waiting for the world to validate what your spirit already knew. And this is the moment most people never recognize when it happens. Because it does not arrive with fireworks, it arrives with calm, and calm is unfamiliar to those who have lived on adrenaline and reaction, but to you it feels like returning home to yourself after a long stretch of misunderstanding, and this return changes everything without asking permission, because once you are anchored internally, the external no longer has leverage over you, and leverage is what kept old dynamics alive. The need to be chosen, the need to be prioritized, the need to be reassured, and you can see now that those needs were never flaws, they were signals pointing you towards self-recognition, and once you answered that signal, the entire structure around you had to respond, because structures are built around expectations, and when expectations change, structures either adapt or collapse, and what collapsed was never yours to carry forward. It was only present to teach you what alignment feels like when it's missing, and now that alignment has returned, you are no longer drawn to what requires effort to sustain connection, because effort was never meant to be the currency of belonging, and this realization frees you from the invisible contracts you didn't know you had signed, the agreements to overextend, to explain yourself, to tolerate confusion for the sake of peace, and peace that requires self-betrayal is not peace, it is delay, and you have moved beyond delay now, into decisiveness that does not rush, and decisiveness that does not rush is one of the clearest signs that the order has changed, because urgency dissolves when trust returns, and trust here is not about other people, it is about yourself, your timing, your discernment, your ability to walk away without dramatizing the exit, and this ability is what distinguishes maturity from detachment, because you are not detached from feeling, you are simply no longer governed by it. And governance is what has shifted, the authority over your inner world has returned to you, and when authority is restored internally, external hierarchies lose their grip, and that is why replacement narratives can no longer disturb you, because they were never about you to begin with, they were about scarcity thinking trying to occupy a space that was never empty, and scarcity always misreads pauses as absence, while abundance understands that pauses are intentional. And you were paused because you were being protected from entanglement that would have cost you clarity, and clarity is too valuable to be traded for temporary reassurance, and now you can see how every moment of restraint contributed to the stability you feel now, how every time you chose silence over reaction you preserved energy that is now available for creation, not correction, and creation is where your focus naturally turns when the past no longer demands resolution, because resolution has already occurred internally, and internal resolution does not seek witnesses, it seeks movement, and movement does not mean returning to old places with new expectations, it means stepping into spaces that recognize you without needing explanation, and recognition without explanation is rare, but it is the natural consequence of alignment, and alignment does not argue, it resonates, and resonance feels effortless, calm, mutual, and this is what you are being oriented toward now, relationships, environments, opportunities that meet you at your level of clarity rather than pulling you back into cycles of proving, and you will notice that what once felt magnetic now feels noisy, what once felt exciting now feels unstable, because your nervous system has recalibrated to peace, and peace has become your baseline. And anything that disrupts that baseline without purpose will feel out of place, and you will not need to justify stepping away from it, because justification belongs to uncertainty, not to clarity, and clarity does not seek permission to choose differently, it simply does, and this simplicity is the quiet reward of everything you endured without hardening your heart, because hardness would have protected you temporarily but cost you softness, and softness combined with strength is what gives you discernment, and discernment is what allows you to remain open without being exposed, receptive without being vulnerable to manipulation, and this balance is rare, but it is exactly what heaven prepares slowly, through misalignment, through misunderstanding, through moments where you are underestimated not to diminish you, but to reveal your capacity to remain yourself without external confirmation. And now that capacity is fully integrated, you are no longer surprised by shifts, you expect alignment to continue refining itself around you, because refinement is not a one-time event, it is an ongoing process, and you trust that process now, not blindly, but because you have witnessed its intelligence firsthand, you have seen how what was out of order corrected itself without your intervention, how what was misassigned revealed its own instability, how what belonged to you returned internally even if it never returned externally, and this distinction matters, because internal return is what restores power, while external return often reopens old dynamics, and you are not meant to reopen what has already served its purpose, you are meant to carry forward the wisdom without carrying forward the weight, and weight is what you have released now, not dramatically, not ceremonially, but naturally, like exhaling after holding your breath longer than you realized, and that exhale creates space, space for new rhythms, new connections, new expressions of self that are not shaped by reaction but by intention, and intention is what guides you now, quietly, steadily, without the need to announce direction, and you will recognize this guidance not by urgency, but by ease, because ease is not laziness, it is alignment in motion, and alignment in motion feels like life meeting you halfway instead of testing your endurance, and this is the true confirmation that the order has changed, not because someone acknowledged it, but because your life no longer requires you to fight for coherence. It flows with it, and as you continue forward from this place, you will not be tempted to measure progress by comparison, because comparison dissolves when self-recognition is complete, and self-recognition is complete when you no longer wonder if you were replaced, because you understand now that what can be replaced was never you, it was a role, an expectation, a projection, and projections collapse when the projector runs out of power, and you have unplugged from that source entirely, and this unplugging is what grants you freedom, freedom to be present, without attachment, engaged without overextension, committed without self-sacrifice, and this freedom is subtle but profound, because it changes how you occupy space, how you speak, how you listen, how you choose, and others will feel this shift even if they cannot name it, because grounded presence is felt before it is understood, and you carry that presence now effortlessly, not because you work to attain it, but because you stopped working against yourself, and that is the quiet triumph of this entire experience, that you emerged not louder, not harder, not more guarded, but clearer, steadier, more yourself than before, and this self is not available for replacement, comparison, or misplacement, because it knows where it stands, and where it stands is aligned with what comes next, and what comes next does not require you to revisit the past to prove the lesson was learned. The lesson is evident in how you move now, calmly, confidently, without needing to look back, because the order has already settled, and you are finally free to live from within it, and now, as everything finally settles into place, you recognize that this ending does not feel like something closing, but like something completing itself naturally, without force, without drama, without unfinished weight pulling at your chest, because completion does not demand attention, it brings relief. And relief is what you are breathing now in a way you didn't even realize you were holding back before, and this relief confirms something important, that nothing was taken from you, nothing was stolen, nothing was lost, because what is truly yours cannot be replaced, it can only be revealed through contrast, and contrast is exactly what you were shown, not to hurt you, but to sharpen your clarity, and clarity has now fully arrived, steady and unquestioned. And with it comes a deep understanding that you no longer need to revisit the story to extract meaning from it, because meaning has already integrated into who you are, into how you move, into how you choose silence over explanation, alignment over attachment, peace over validation, and this is the mark of someone who has outgrown the need for resolution through others, because your resolution has become internal, complete, irreversible. And this is why nothing from the past feels unfinished anymore, even if it was never spoken, even if it was never acknowledged, even if it was never corrected aloud, because truth does not require agreement. To be real, it only requires time to surface, and time has done its work now, quietly, thoroughly, without your interference, and you can trust this outcome because it did not leave you restless, it left you grounded, and grounding is always the signal that something has ended cleanly, without residue, without hooks, without unfinished emotional contracts waiting to be reopened, and this is where your freedom actually begins. Not in celebration, not in vindication, but in simplicity, the simplicity of no longer carrying questions that once demanded answers, the simplicity of not scanning faces for recognition, the simplicity of not needing to be placed correctly by others because you are already positioned internally, and this internal position cannot be shaken by substitution narratives, by misjudgments, by temporary appearances, because it is anchored in self-recognition. And self-recognition is the one thing that makes replacement irrelevant, and now you see it clearly, that the moment someone believed they replaced you was never about you losing ground, It was about you leaving a space that could only be understood once it was mishandled, and mishandling always exposes value, because value is not proven by possession, it is proven by absence, and your absence spoke louder than your presence ever could, and that message has been received where it needed to be received. Not because you demanded it, but because reality could no longer avoid it, and this is the quiet justice of alignment, that it does not require confrontation to correct itself, it simply removes distortion until truth is the only thing left standing, and truth is what you are standing in now, without effort, without resistance, without needing to guard your heart or overextend your grace, because your heart is no longer under negotiation, it is settled. And this settlement is what allows you to move forward cleanly, without dragging echoes of the past into places they do not belong, and you will notice how light your decisions feel now, how unforced your boundaries are, how natural your detachment is from what once consumed mental space, because detachment here is not coldness, it is completion, and completion frees energy, energy that now belongs to you again, fully available for creation, connection, and presence that is not shaped by reaction but by intention, and intention is what guides you now, quietly but firmly, without urgency, without confusion, without second-guessing, and this guidance will continue to lead you toward what recognizes you without testing you, toward what meets you without comparison, toward what aligns without asking you to shrink or explain, and you will not rush this, because you no longer fear being left behind. You understand now that being paused was protection, not rejection, and protection has done its job, leaving you clearer, stronger, more whole than before. And this wholeness is what you carry forward, not the story, not the lesson, not the pain, but the wisdom distilled from it, and wisdom does not revisit old rooms to prove it learned something, it simply chooses better rooms, and you will choose better now without effort, without announcement, because choice has become intuitive rather than reactive, and this intuition is calm, precise, grounded, and trustworthy, and you trust yourself now in a way that cannot be undone, because trust built through endurance does not collapse under uncertainty, it stabilizes you through it, and this stability is your new foundation, one that does not need reinforcement through attention or reassurance, because it is self-sustaining, and from this foundation, your life will continue to rearrange itself in ways that feel natural rather than forced, aligned rather than urgent, peaceful rather than performative, and you will recognize these shifts not by intensity, but by ease. Because ease is the language of alignment, and alignment is what remains when everything unnecessary has fallen away, and everything unnecessary has fallen away now, leaving you exactly where you are meant to be, not ahead, not behind, not waiting, but present, complete, and ready, without needing to prove anything further, because the order has changed, the lesson has integrated, and the chapter has closed itself fully, quietly, cleanly, and you can move forward from here without looking back, knowing that nothing important was missed, nothing valuable was lost, and nothing essential remains unfinished, because what mattered has already been resolved within you, and that resolution is final.